Good evening, everybody. I am so excited. We are live. I'm really, really excited about tonight's event. And I know it takes a few minutes for everybody to get in here. As you join us, thank you for taking time out of your Sunday evening to come and join myself and our special guest today, Dr. Adam Bernstein. Um, I'm very excited that I don't have a lot to do today. I don't have a lot to do today, but I'm really excited to finally be doing some of what I hope the postgraduate training series would be able to do. And that is to expose student pharmacists, prospective residency candidates, as well as current residents to people that I think could be really, really helpful in their professional development. And folks that are doing things that could really greatly contribute to making this incredibly convoluted and sometimes challenging journey a little less intimidating and challenging for them. And tonight's guest, Adam, is my first person that I am including in the postgraduate training for a workshop and for an education session that I personally think is for all pharmacists of all experience levels interested in gaining better command over how they use and leverage Excel in their clinical practice, but also projects. My name is Sally Traore Ualaka. I am the founder of ResiPrep 360. It is a program that focuses on helping prospective candidates secure postgraduate positions and connecting you with resources and making that year or next 2 years a little less intimidating and challenging for you. And tonight, without further ado, I'm so excited to have with us Dr. Adam Bernstein. I never do bios because I think it's super important for you guys to hear directly from the guests as they share with you their journeys and as he gets into today a little bit about our workshop and what we are going to be talking about. So, without further ado, Adam, it's all yours.
Awesome. And apologies if I missed anything while my screen froze and came back in. But I
Yeah.
am really excited to work with you as well as the pharmacy a simulated medication use evaluation.
Yes.
So with Sparx Analytics, I teach students as well as pharmacists different techniques for data analysis. We work mostly with Microsoft Excel, which is what we'll be using tonight, as well as SQL, which is a different coding language. And I really enjoy working with students and other pharmacists to help them either directly on projects or just training in general, like we'll be doing tonight, to prep them for projects that they might be working on. So working with schools of pharmacy, currently working with residents on their projects, as well as one-on-one training. And the great thing about some of the training we do at Sparx Analytics, especially if it's direct project consultation, is it doesn't require us to see any confidential information. So the residents that I'm currently working with on their projects, they didn't need any data use agreements or IRB modifications. I learn just through some structured questions. We'll talk about the data, learn what their data might look like, and then I build a simulated data set that sort of emulates what they'll be doing. And then I teach them some targeted information using the simulated data that they can then apply back to their actual data. So at Sparx Analytics, I really like to empower the groups that I work with. So tonight, because medication use evaluations and other forms of quality improvement projects will either come up as a student or on rotation or postgraduate training for residency, fellowship, or even if you're just a pharmacist in a clinic, a manager, or direct patient care pharmacist, there'll be times that you want to improve the care delivery model that you work within. And sometimes working with large data sets can be very intimidating if you haven't had training to do it. And myself, when I got started in residency with my first project, I did not know much about data analytics. And I spent, Sally, I think I told you the story, I spent maybe a whole weekend trying to learn one advanced function. And by the time I got it, I was like, this only takes 30 seconds. If only there was someone to show me how to do it directly. That's sort of where I got the bug for working with data. And so I've been working in pharmacy analytics since completing my PGY1 and PGY2 at UNC Medical Center. So I've worked for a couple of years on an analytics team, done some health system analytics consulting, and now working in health tech in the pharmacy landscape. So
Awesome.
yeah,
We're
seeing some of
excited.
my,
Too many of us can identify with that. I tell you right now,
yeah,
like you spent 2 hours learning an enhanced function and you're like, okay, so it's just 2 clicks. Got it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so tonight we'll be going through a simulated medication use evaluation. And so I will share my screen to bring up the Excel file. If you're watching live right now, in the event on LinkedIn, I put a comment with a link to the website where you can download the data set that I'll be using today. It's not required for you to follow along, but if you'd like to, you'll have all of the information that I'll be working with tonight. So that way you can get some practice as well.
Very good.
All right, so sharing my screen. Awesome. All right. So if you have the file open, right here on the cover page, this is the prompt that we'll be working with tonight. So imagine you are a pharmacist in a cardiology clinic and would like to maximize the use of SGLT2 inhibitors in patients with HFrEF. So using the data on the subsequent sheets, these ones here in blue, we'll identify which patients have HFrEF and who may be candidates for SGLT2 inhibitor therapy. So for this one, you see I have a couple of extra tabs. If you've downloaded the file from my website, you have these as well. They're just hidden. So if you just right click on any of the tabs, this unhide will be not grayed out. You'll be able to click it and you can unhide these as you go along. I just have them hidden in your version just because it can make it look a little cluttered, but we will be going through each of these tonight. All right, and so here is our data collection tool. So whenever you're doing an analysis, it's always great to have a data collection tool which represents what's the final format of the data that we want after we're done analyzing everything. So these are all of the variables that we would want. So in this case, we're gonna have one row per patient, and we're gonna be identifying, do they have heart failure with reduced ejection fraction? As well as we'll be looking up some other criteria that will help us to identify if they're a candidate for SGLT2 therapy, such as are they already on an SGLT2? When will they be seen in the clinic next? As well as some baseline labs, such as their GFR and what is their current ejection fraction. In the MUE that we'll be going over tonight, we're going to go over some of the foundational concepts that I teach in our foundations class, as well as some intermediate topics. So it's going to be combining a few of them. We have a certificate class or workshop coming up November 4th and 5th, if anyone is interested, where we will be doing 4 hours of that foundational coursework. So tonight we'll be doing somewhat of an abbreviated version, but enough to where you'll really be able to get some analytics techniques out of it. All right, so here, not only do we have the variables that we'll be pulling, but we also have a data dictionary. So I always recommend that you have a data dictionary, especially if there's going to be multiple people working on the project. So maybe it's a student research project and there's 2 or 3 students who are all going to be working together. You want to make sure everybody's working off of the same definition of what each of these mean, especially when they can have multiple variables at play. So even with this first variable, we'll talk about how we're going to pull in what last visit and next visit means. So for next visit, it needs to be the next chronological visit at your cardiology clinic, but it's not going to be canceled visits. It's only going to be scheduled visits. So having all of the nuances in your data dictionary will just help to make sure everyone is going to be operating off of those same definitions. At Sparx Analytics, I also like to teach a 3-part or 3-step approach to your analysis. That is to explore your data, so performing an exploratory data analysis up front. You'll then perform the assessment, which is actually cleaning and analyzing your data. And then finally, validating the results that you get just to make sure that they're accurate. Tonight, we're going to be focusing mostly on that analysis component, but I will talk briefly about the exploration as well as validation steps, just so that way you have some context for them. So first off, I'll introduce you to the data set, and this is actually going to be that exploration phase. So it's good to see, well, what's the data that we're working with? And depending on how familiar you are with the data source that you'll be working with, you may want to budget more time for an exploratory data analysis than you would if it's data that you've seen and analyzed multiple times. But here in these blue tabs, we have 3 data sets that we're going to be working with. One is going to be for visits for those patients at the cardiology clinic. And you can see we have some information. We have an encounter number that goes along with the patient ID. So the encounter number is going to be specific to that visit itself. We've got the date of the visit, who was the provider they were seeing, what was the primary diagnosis code, what was their blood pressure that was taken during the visit, and heart rate. And then we also have a status of that visit. So was the visit completed? Was it canceled? Or is it scheduled? You'll see as we get down below, there's a lot of visits that are scheduled. So as part of the exploration, it's always great just to see what are the data types that we're working with, when can there be missing data, and is that missing data appropriate, or is it potentially missing data that we'll have to either go and repull or somehow account for. So one easy way to do that is if you just click anywhere within your data, and you click this data tab within the ribbon, so this top portion of Excel is called the ribbon. I like to then just click this filter button, and you can see these drop-down arrows now appear for our column headers. So here we can see a unique listing of each of the values. So this is just going to show each unique patient ID. If we did provider, we can see there are 4 providers at the clinic. Primary diagnosis codes, you can see we have some of these as well. And then for our blood pressure, you can see we have blank values here. So let's explore those blank values first. So I'm going to unclick the select all and scroll down to the bottom, and then I'll click blanks. And so we can see here, whenever those vitals aren't taken, our status is either canceled or scheduled. So that kind of makes sense. So if the visit was actually completed, then they'll always have their vitals taken. And if they're empty, they're canceled or scheduled. So here we have some null or missing data, but that's actually appropriate. I have this filtered. I could either click back in here and clear this filter, or I can just uncheck this filter button here. Those filter bars go away, and so does the filter itself. And then I can click it back if we want to be able to view anything. But so here we have visit data. Here we have the current medication list on the next tab, and you can see it's just the patient ID and then the generic name of each of the medications on their medication list. And then we have some results. So these are going to be things like labs or imaging that have results coming back. So we have things like their creatinine, their calculated GFR, as well as their ejection fraction, if applicable for that patient. All right, so now we've taken a look at our data itself. Let's start thinking about what's the information that we need to pull. So here we've got our last visit and our next visit. So these are going to come from our visits tab. And we want to know when was the last time that patient was seen in the cardiology clinic. So to do that, we already have the encounter number that is their last completed visit at the cardiology clinic. So all we have to do is now pull in what was the visit date of this encounter number. One way to do that is with lookup functions. So we'll use the XLOOKUP function to do this. If you've worked with Excel before the newest version of Excel for Office 365 came out, VLOOKUP and index match were 2 of the primary ways to do this. But Office 365 introduced a new lookup function called XLOOKUP, which solves for a lot of the limitations of a VLOOKUP and makes the syntax a little bit easier than index match. So if you haven't worked with lookups before, XLOOKUP is probably the one to go with, and that's what we'll be demoing today. So before we actually pull in this information, I'm going to give a brief demonstration. So in the workshops that I give and the one-on-one coaching I do, before we do the analysis, we'll usually do a demonstration period, and then I'll turn it over to the participants to actually do exercises and answer questions using the new skill that we've demonstrated. Tonight, I'm just going to do the demonstration and flip back to the analysis, but wanted to just give some more information as to how that will work in workshops with Sparx Analytics. So here we just have a small data set. We have the patient and encounter number, and it's a very similar scenario. We'd like to pull in the visit date from our source information over here on the right. Now, we only have 2 patients, so we could just look up the encounter number and copy and paste. But when you have much larger sets of data, you'll want a way to automate this. That way you're not having to copy and paste hundreds, thousands of times. So let's talk about the syntax of an XLOOKUP function. So I'm going to click into the visit date here. And I'm going to click type equals. Anytime you're writing a formula or a function, you'll always start with an equal sign. And I'm going to start typing the name of XLOOKUP. And you can see here, as I'm typing, it's going to list all of the functions that just begin with the letters I've already typed. So there's only one here, XLOOKUP. It's going to give a description of that function. So we're going to look for a match on some variable and then pull a corresponding item once that match is found. So for us, we're going to be searching for this encounter number. And once the encounter number is found, pull the visit date from that corresponding row. So with this highlighted, you could double click on XLOOKUP. You could finish just typing XLOOKUP, or with it highlighted, you can hit Tab and it will auto-populate the function name. Once we have that function name appearing, it's going to show us the parameters of the function, as well as in bold, which parameter are we currently on. So we haven't typed anything. So right now we're on this first parameter called the lookup value. The lookup value is what item do we want to match? So in this case, we want to match the encounter number here with the encounter number from our data set. So our lookup value is going to be this encounter number. And you can see when I clicked by left clicking on B2, it's the cell reference B2 that has been brought in here. And that's what we want because we're going to be actually copying this formula down the column. And so we're going to want cell references to automatically update for us rather than just typing in this encounter number exactly. With the lookup value now entered, I'll type in a comma, and you can see we're now onto the second parameter because this one is now bold, and it's the lookup array. The lookup array is where are we going to find the lookup value? So in what range of data? So the lookup array is going to be found in this encounter number column. So I'm just going to left click and drag down, and you can see it's now put in this range F2 to F7. One thing that I'm going to do in addition to this is because Excel tries to be helpful and shift ranges as you move that function down, as we copy it down here, that's not always helpful. It'll be helpful for this B2 value, which I'll show you once we've entered it, but we always want it to be searching through F2 to F7. So I'm going to hit F4, and it's going to put these dollar signs before the column and row of each of these. Now you can just keep hitting F4 and you can see it's going to toggle the dollar sign. In this case, we're just going to leave it as both. And what this means is keep F2 to F7 static. So it's always going to be referencing column F, and it's always going to be referencing the rows 2 to 7, no matter how this formula gets dragged down the column. We won't need this when we're actually doing our analysis separately because I'm going to show you how to work with tables. But in this instance, we will need to make those static. Our return array is going to be, okay, once we've found the match, where do we find, or what is the data that we want to pull back? You can think of this as being like, what's the value we'd like to copy and paste if we were to manually be doing this? So in this case, we want to be copying and pasting that visit date. So that is our return array. And similar to the lookup array, we always want it to be returning from this set of cells. So let's make this static. So again, I'm going to hit F4, and you can see it's placed the dollar signs in there. If you're having any trouble with F4, you can actually just type in the dollar signs with Shift and the number 4, and that will also work. The value, if not found, match mode, and search mode, you can see these parameters are in square brackets. Any parameter that is in a square bracket is optional. So you don't actually have to enter those, but they can be useful, and we'll use one of them later on. We'll use this if not found. But for now, I'm just going to close my parentheses and then hit enter. And you can see the visit dates now in here. So if we look for this one, so it ends in 893, 893, it pulled 1119, which is exactly what we pulled here. Now, if we want to automate this calculation for all the remaining data, while you have the visit date cell clicked, there's a green square in the bottom right-hand corner of this cell. And when I hover my mouse cursor over it, it turns into this black cross. It starts as a thicker white cross, and then once you're in the bottom, it turns into the thinner black cross. You can either left click and drag down, or if you undo, you can just double click the bottom right, and it will go down as far as it thinks your data set is. So that's really helpful when you have a large data set. And we can double check here, this 387 number should pull October 23rd, and it does. All right, so now that we've seen it, let's apply this back to our data set in our data collection tool. So we know we're going to be pulling this visit information from visits. Now, this information's on separate tabs. So when we were doing this here, our data collection tool here was actually on the same sheet as the reference data. But in this case, we have two separate sheets. And clicking back and forth to drag those references is somewhat cumbersome. It can be a little bit error prone as well. So what we're going to do is put this data into a table. That way we can reference it on a separate spreadsheet. So clicking anywhere within our table of data here, I'm going to go up to Insert on the ribbon, and then I'm going to click Table. Excel is going to guess how the shape of our data with these green dotted lines. It's pretty good at it unless you have a lot of breaks in your data. So I'm going to leave it as is, and I'm going to leave my table has headers checked because this first row are really just headers of the column, and I'd like those to be the header names. So I'm going to click OK. I can tell this information is now in a table because the format of the table has now changed, so it's a different color, as well as this table design option up in the ribbon is now there. So if I left click out of the table, it goes away. If I click back in, the table design option reappears. I'm going to left click this, and all we're going to do now is just rename this table. So table 5, without coming to look at it, would be really hard for me to know that this is table 5. I'm just going to call it something that's more representative of the data. So I'm going to call it visits. So all I did was left click in here, type visits, and then hit enter. And that's going to let us refer to this table of data through this name in our functions. So when we're on the data collection tool, we don't actually have to click back into this data to use that information in our functions. So now I'm going to click back to the data collection tool. And again, for last visit, I'm going to do an XLOOKUP. So I'm going to do equals and start typing XLOOKUP. I'm going to hit tab so it auto-populates the formula name. Our lookup value is going to be the same as the demo we did. So I'm going to left click encounter number, and you can see it is put in the reference here. This information is, or the data collection tool is already in a table. So instead of it saying B2, it's just using the reference of the table. I will do comma. And our lookup array now is going to be the encounter number column of the visits table. So instead of having to click back in and drag to get that range, I'm just going to start by typing our table name visits. And you can see it's now an option. You can either double click the visits logo here, or you can hit tab and it will auto-populate it. And now here comes the real selling feature of tables. If you do an open square bracket, I can now see all of the columns within that table. So if I want to reference an entire column of visits, I don't have to go and get the exact dimensions of that column. I can just toggle up and down and select encounter number, again, either by double clicking it or hitting tab once you have it highlighted. And then I will do a closing square bracket. So this now represents all of the encounter numbers within that table. And we don't have to use the dollar signs or F4 to make something static because it will always know to just use that one set or that one column. And now our return array is going to be that visit date again. So we're going to use that column from the visits table. So we can start by typing the name of our table, which is visits. With it highlighted, I'm going to hit tab and then open square bracket. And then this time I'm going to toggle down to the visit date. With that highlighted, I'll hit tab again, close my square brackets, and then I'll close my parenthesis. I'll pause here just in case anyone is following along and wants to see this. I'll talk back through this. So we're using the lookup function to find the visit date that goes with this encounter number. So our lookup value is the encounter number in cell B2. The lookup array is going to be the column of encounter numbers within our visits table. And the date of that visit, which is our return array, is going to be the visit date column of our visits table. With this typed in, I can hit enter. And we now have the visit date for all of our encounter numbers pulled in automatically. All right, let's talk about how are we going to get the next visit. So thinking through what the next visit, what that timestamp represents, it's essentially the earliest date that is greater than our last visit. So how are we going to figure this out? Are there date functions that help us? Actually, we can use what's called the min-ifs function. And the reason we can use the min-ifs function, so just taking the min of these dates, is because Excel treats numbers or treats dates as numbers behind the scenes. So here I'm showing a date. Really, though, if I go up and just change this, 45,163 represents August 25th, 2023. So in Excel, just add this to the side. These numbers here actually represent dates. So 0 is the starting point in Excel, and it's this fake date called January 0th of 1900. Why they picked this date, I have no idea. But every unit greater than 0 is one more day. So 1 is January 1st, 2 would be January 2nd, and so forth. The decimal after the 1, if let's say we did 1.75, is going to be the hours and minutes that represent 3/4 of a day. So let's change this value here to be a date and time. And you can see now 1.75 is actually January 1st of 1900 at 6 p.m. If I change this to 1.5, that's half a day. So it'll be actually 12 p.m., which we need to make sure that this one is also 1.5. And you can see, let's pull up a date and time. That's interesting. We'll just do it on this one. It is the January 1st at 12 p.m. What's kind of interesting is it's not displaying it this way just because of the time component being selected. So, but we can see here it's treating it as 12 p.m. So let's now we could just do the min function, but that's going to give us the earliest date for all of the patients. What we really need is the earliest date by patient. So here I've just got 2 patients staged for us. What we can do is I'm just going to take a unique listing of each of these. So unique is a dynamic array function, and it's being stored as text right now. Let's see. It's interesting. I think I have flipped the setting to where it is not showing me my function names or the results of the functions. Bear with me one moment. There we go. All right, so here we go. If that happened to any of you, I think I did that accidentally, but I was just showing the formulas. So it's great. You get to see us troubleshoot in real time. But here we've got the 2 patient IDs, and I just want the earliest visit date for each of them. So for this patient, it should be 8/25, and for this patient, it should be 5/5. So if we do min ifs, so I'll start typing that function. It's going to return the minimum value among cells specified by a given condition. So our min range, we want it to be this visit date. So once it finds that match, this is what we want the min value to be of. Because we don't have this in tables, I'm going to hit F4 to make that static. Our criteria range is going to be the patient ID. And again, I will use F4 to make that static. And our criteria is this patient. So let's talk through this real quick. It's going to say, we're going to look for our patient ID. So this is the criteria range. Once it finds this patient, it's going to collect all of the visit dates and take the minimum value. So here, again, it's storing it as text. And let's drag this down and show these as short dates. So we have the 8/25, and for this patient, we have 5/5. So this is going to help us find minimum dates. Now we have other criteria that we want to put in there. We also want to make sure it's a completed visit. So we'll show that on the data collection tool itself. So the visits table is already in a table, or the visits data is already in a table for us. So when we go back here for our next visit, again, we'll want to do the min ifs for the visit dates for this patient, but we're also going to want to make sure that the visit date is greater than the last visit date, as well as it should be completed for this visit status. So let's talk through how to do these. So again, we're going to type min ifs. And you can see it's going to return the minimum value by a given condition or set of conditions. Our min range, we'll type in the visits table. I'm going to do the open square bracket again. And here we want the visit date. So I'll tab that. And this is now our minimum range. So once it's matched all of our criteria, it's going to take the minimum from the values that it pulls back from the visit date column. Now our criteria range 1 is going to be the patient ID. So I'll start by typing our visits table, open square bracket, and this time instead of encounter number, we're going to do patient ID and tab, and then a closing square bracket. Our criteria 1 is going to be this patient ID itself. And so we now have that first criteria that we just did on the demo side of the MNIFs. You can see here in square brackets, we have criteria range 2, criteria 2, and ... What this is saying is you can have as many ranges for criteria as you'd like, but because they're in these square brackets, they're optional. You really just have to have one at a minimum. We're going to end up having 3. So I'm going to do a comma, and you can see now criteria range 2 is bold. And our second criteria is going to be that the status of the visit was completed. So let's do visits. Again, with the open square bracket, it's this visit status that now we want to use as our criteria range. So I'll hit tab, and then I'll close my square brackets. For criteria 2, I'm going to say it has to be the value completed, and we can just type in a static text value. And anytime you're typing in a text value that should be used as the criteria, you want to make sure it's in double quotes. So here I'm just going to put in double quotes and then completed, and I'll close with another set of double quotes. All right, one more comma for now getting to criteria range 3. And this is the range where we need the visit date to be greater than this last visit. That way it's going to be pulling what's their next visit. So we'll go back to the visits table. And for here, we're going to use visit date. So you'll notice we're actually using the visit date column twice. One for what we're going to perform the min function on, but here also as a criteria to make sure that that visit is greater than the current visit. Now, something that we haven't talked about yet with this function is the criteria pair always defaults to being in equals for the match. So here, status has to equal completed. Here, the patient ID has to equal encounter number. Well, for the visit date, we don't want them to be equal. We want the visit date to be greater than this last visit date. So how do we put that into this function for it to know how to do that? If you want to do greater than, less than, greater than, equal to, less than, equal to, any of those operators, you can change the function to use those operators by using another set of quotes. So we'll do double quote, greater than, and then double quote again. So this is telling Excel, we want this criteria to be greater than. And because we're going to use a cell reference, we want it to be looking at the value here of C2 for this row specifically. We will do ampersand, and then we can click this value. Now we know it's correctly using a cell reference because here the value is a different color, which is letting you know that it's an active reference and not just a value that is static. I'll then close my parentheses and hit enter. All right, and you can see we're getting zeros back for everybody, which means we have an issue. And so let's see. So we're matching visits with patients, status with completed, visit dates. All right, let's see what might be the issue. So that is a goof up on my part. It can't be completed yet if it's in the future. We actually want scheduled visits. So let's just delete this and we'll do scheduled and hit enter. And there they are. Now they're showing up as the numeric version again. So I'm just going to highlight all of this information with a keyboard shortcut, and then I'll do short date. So what I'm doing here to be able to jump between the top and the bottom of this column is I'm just holding Control. I'm using a PC, so if you're using a Mac, it might be the Command button, but I'm just going to do Control up and down, and it's going to bring me to the cell that is adjacent to an empty cell. So you can see if I go left and right, it's going to stop on column D. Now if I hold Shift and Control, that's how I can highlight. So gone are the days that you have to like left click and drag all the way down. You can just do Shift Control and click down, or on a Mac, a separate set of keyboard commands and highlight that entire column. So we now have our next visit. let's just double check that this patient is pulling in the right visit date. So ends in 494. Hopefully it'll be then 5:30. So let's just type this in. You can see we only have one patient that ends in 494. So here was the visit date that we initially pulled, the 5/1. So that was their last visit date. Now we skipped this one because it was canceled, which is appropriate. That's not when we would potentially be intervening on the patient if we were waiting for their next visit. But their next scheduled visit is 11:30. So this appears to be working as intended now. So I'm just going to uncheck those bars to get rid of our filter, and we'll come back. All right, our heart failure diagnosis. In the real world, coming up with diagnoses can be very challenging. It can be multifactorial, depending on the disease state and the data that you have. In this instance, we're going to be using this primary diagnosis code column here. And I've got the diagnosis codes for HFrEF just listed in this table. And to figure out if this is for a value of HFrEF, there's a couple different ways. I mean, you could use XLOOKUP again just to see if a value is found. But we're going to use the COUNTIF function. I find the COUNTIF function to be very versatile. So wanted to make sure we could demonstrate it here. And what the COUNTIF function is going to do is it's very similar to MINIF, where it was going to say, check some criteria, and for all the values that match that criteria, pull the min of it. This is going to say, check some criteria and just count how many times that criteria is matched. Now, because there's only one primary diagnosis code per visit, that count, if it's matched, will always just be 1. And if it's not matched, it will just be 0. So here, if we wanted to figure out if they have heart failure or not from that primary diagnosis code, I'm going to start by typing in our function, which is COUNTIF. And you can see there's two, COUNTIF and COUNTIFs. The only difference is COUNTIFs will let you do multiple criteria ranges and criteria pairs, similar to MAXIFs. COUNTIF is just going to be for 1. Here, we're just going to be matching off of 1, so COUNTIF will be just fine. The first criteria is, well, what range are we going to be looking in? And we want to look in this range of our diagnosis code. So I will just highlight all of those cells. And you can see this is already in a table, so we don't have to make that cell reference static. I'll do a comma, and the criteria that we're going to be matching on is the primary diagnosis code of this visit. We can now see this patient does have HFrEF, so we see that diagnosis code there. We can see that all of these patients should, because I50.20 is also heart failure. It's just this last patient that won't. And so we can see we're getting the results that we would expect. Now, I'm using 0s and 1s to represent no and yes, rather than typing in no or yes or N and Y. The reason why I like to use 1s and 0s is because if you just need a quick spot check of your data to see, either validating it, or if you want to just get a quick analysis of how often something occurring, here with this data highlighted, if we look in the bottom right-hand corner, Excel's actually calculating some summary statistics for us. So we can see a sum of 6 and a count of 7. So because we did 1s and 0s, this sum of 6 will represent 6 of these visits are with heart failure out of the 7 total. So 85.7% of the visits that we have here were for HFrEF. So 1s and 0s, just make that a little friendlier if you want to use this functionality. But it would be totally appropriate to also just do N's and Y's, no's and yeses, or anything else that might represent how you'd like to code your data. All right, so let's go back to our visits data, because here we're going to have to determine, was this diagnosis code for HFrEF? So let's create a new column. So I'm just going to right-click on column F and then click Insert. And you can see it's already added a new column, and this table is already within our table, so we don't have to reinsert anything into the table. I'm then just going to call this HFrEF. I'll hit Enter. Great. And so similar to before, we will use the COUNTIF function. So let's do equals COUNTIF. Our range is going to be the exact same formula we were doing before. Let's highlight this information. We can see it's already in a table for us. I'll then do comma, and our criteria is going to be that primary diagnosis code. I'll close my parentheses and hit Enter. And you can see we now have all of that information. So we can see in our cardiology clinic, 69% of the encounters that we have listed are going to be for HFrEF, which just shows there are patients in the cardiology clinic who likely attend for other cardiology diagnoses. And so those aren't going to be patients that we are looking to include to see if we would add an SGLT2 to their therapy. All right, if we want to resize this column, we can either just left click and drag, or when you put the cursor between two columns and we now have these bidirectional arrows, if you just double click, it will reformat to automatically be the width just wide enough to display all of the results in the column header as well as below. All right, flipping back to the data collection tool, we now have a heart failure diagnosis code in our visits. But some patients might attend the clinic for multiple diagnoses. So they might have a heart failure appointment, and maybe they're also there to get their INR checked if they have AFib, and that's the only reason for them to appear in the clinic at a future date. So we don't want to just pull the first encounter or the diagnosis code with just that one encounter number from the data collection tool. We want to see if any of their encounters were for HFrEF. So similar to how we did min ifs, we can now use the max ifs on this column because it's either going to be a 0 or 1. And as long as they have at least one value of 1 in HFrEF, the max will be 1. So it's going to be very similar syntax, but we'll now use max ifs to get heart failure diagnosis. So we'll start by just typing max ifs. And I will tab. Our max range is going to be, again, using the visits table. So I'll type visits with an open square bracket. Our max range is going to be this HFrEF column with closing square brackets. Our criteria range is going to be matching on the patient ID. So from visits, we will do patient ID, closing square brackets, and then our criteria is going to be this patient ID here. And then close this. So it's going to say pull the maximum value that they had in the heart failure diagnosis column anywhere the patient ID in the visits table matches this patient ID over here. We now have our list of patients. So it looks like 34 out of 49 of these patients have heart failure. So when we get to the end of this analysis, we can quickly exclude the patients who wouldn't be a target for our intervention. Looking now to the blood pressure. So we have some of these columns over here that are going to help us determine would they be an appropriate candidate for SGLT2 therapy. Some of these were actual exclusion criteria from the trials that got empagliflozin and dapagliflozin indicated for heart failure. So let's see if we can pull in their blood pressure to know if they are just hypotensive at baseline. So that information is also in our visits tab. But you can see here, our blood pressure is in a single column. So it's showing both systolic and diastolic at the same time. But in our data collection tool, we want them separated. So how will we go about doing that? You could do it one of two ways. You could either pull in the blood pressure and then split it in the data collection tool, or we can split it here and then just pull in the systolic and the diastolic respectively. I think I'm going to split them in here. So I'm going to right click on column H and then just insert a new column. And I'm going to rename these. I'm going to call this SBP for systolic blood pressure, and we'll do DBP for diastolic blood pressure. The reason I'm doing that is because when we split this, only the systolic blood pressure will be left in this column, and then all of the diastolic blood pressures will be in this column. So I'm going to highlight all of the information in this one column again. You can see how it's not doing the entire column just because we have gaps in the data. And with this highlighted, I'm going to go back up into the data tab of the ribbon, and we're going to use this feature called text to columns. What text to columns does is it lets you specify a delimiter that anytime that delimiter is found, it should split the remaining values into a separate column. So here, with it highlighted, I'm just going to click it, and we want to go with this delimited value. So I'll hit next. I'm going to uncheck tab and click other, because our delimiter is actually this /. So when I add it in, you can see here we now get a preview in this window of what that data looks like after it splits it. If I delete this again, you can see all of that information is in one column. If I add the /, it is now in 2 separate columns. I will hit next and then finish. And it's saying there is already data there, which is fun. So one of the fun things about text to columns is there has to be enough room. So I'm just going to add another column to see what it was when it said that there was already data there. I'll go back and add this. And you can see we now have this. There's nothing actually in there, so I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. The thing you need to be careful with text to columns is if there could have been, let's say, a third value, which would never happen with blood pressures, which is why it was okay for us to use text to columns, it would actually try and overwrite data that was already in the adjacent column. It won't automatically create a new column for you, which is what that prompt was that appeared when we tried to do it. Now, in this case, there wasn't actually any data in there, so it was safe for us to do, but if you are using it on things like names, you just need to be careful because someone might have a 2-part last name. So if you had first and last name, it might take 3 columns or it might take more depending on how those names are formatted. All right, so we now have 2 separate columns for systolic blood pressure and then diastolic blood pressure. So we can come back to our data collection tool and we'll just do an XLOOKUP. So we will start by doing the XLOOKUP. And here our definition is going to be the systolic and diastolic blood pressure from the most recent cardiology visit. So it's going to be here for this encounter number. So our lookup value is going to be the encounter number. Our lookup array is going to come from the visits table. And we are going to on encounter number. Our return array is also going to be from the visits table. And this time it's going to be the systolic blood pressure. So I'll close my parentheses there. And now watch what happens when I hit enter. We have all of those values appear. Now we can do the exact same thing for diastolic. And instead of having to type this all out again, because the syntax is going to be the same, I'm actually just going to copy and paste it over. Instead of copying this cell though, I'm going to come up into the formula bar and then hit copy. And I will just come back up in here and paste. And the reason that is I'm just in the habit of doing it because if you had cell references not from a table, Excel will try and adjust those, similar to how if the cell reference doesn't have those dollar signs, and that's not always what you want. So I'm just going to paste this in here, get rid of SBP, and we'll do DBP. And we now have that information for all of our patients. All right, let's now see, are they already on an SGLT2 inhibitor? All right, to do this, we're going to go to the current medication list tab. And for this, there's a couple of different ways. Let's explore this data first. So we have the generic name, and we can see here it is not too many options. And if we just type in one of the suffixes for the SGLT2 inhibitors, we can see it only pulls those. So knowing that I can use Flozin as a keyword to match for these, let's actually use wildcards to identify if this is an SGLT2 inhibitor, and then again, pulling in the max over to our data collection tool. There'd be other ways to do this, but using wildcards, I just want to show you that way you're getting a glimpse at another tool that Excel offers. So let's jump over to the wildcard section. We're again use countifs or countif, and countif lets you use wildcards within their function. So I'll start by typing the function and then I'll tell you what I mean by wildcard. So again, let's use countif. Our range is just going to be this one cell here. We're going to do it at the row level. So let's just count if each of these to see if it's an SGLT2. And then here for our criteria, instead of typing in the name of an SGLT2 inhibitor, the entire thing, we can just type in the portion that would signify it within our data set. So here, I'm going to use an asterisk. So asterisk means we don't really care any of the characters that come before. And then I will do Flozin. And then I will close or finish with an extra set of quotations, and then close this. Now, again, you have to be careful because wildcards aren't always unique. So in this example, we know it'll work because we checked our data, but that may not be the case for all medication names. So just to be careful with it. You can see it's going to show 0 because it did not find Flozin anywhere within that cell. And if I drag it, double click it down, you can see only empagliflozin has the 1 here. So let's do the same with our data set, and then we'll just use the max ifs again to figure out if they're currently on an SGLT2 inhibitor. All right, so flipping back to the current medication list, let's create a new column here called SGLT2, and we'll use the exact same function. So we'll do count if. Our range is just going to be this one cell. And again, our criteria is going to be the asterisk for the wildcard. We'll close our parentheses. Take this and then double click it down. And let's check our results. So let's just look at all of the values for 1. And you can see here, it's just SGLT2 inhibitors. And if I were to double check it the other way, okay, all of our values have a 1. So it looks like it is working appropriately. And now we can put this information into a table just like we did the visits information, and we can then reference it from the data collection tool. So clicking anywhere within the data here, I'm going to go back up to Insert and then Table. I'm going to leave the My Table Has Headers box checked. And now we have a table. We see this table design option in the ribbon reappear. And I'll just rename this one Meds. So on our data collection tool, we'll again use max ifs on our meds table to see if they're on an SGLT2 inhibitor. So let's do max ifs. Our max range is going to be from this meds table, open square bracket to see the columns. And we're going to perform the max on the SGLT2 column. Our criteria range is going to be the patient column of meds. And then open square bracket for the patient ID, close square bracket. And then our criteria is going to be our patient ID. Close the square bracket or parenthesis, and you can see we now have it. So let's just check these two to make sure it's working correctly. So 494 and 952. If we want to add an extra one to this selection, I'm going to come here and just click Add to Current Selection. That way it doesn't overwrite the previous filter. And we can see for 494, they are not on an SGLT2, and they're actually on 2 insulin glargines, which not uncommon to see that happen on a med list. And then here, this patient is on dapagliflozin, and so appropriately on the data collection tool, we were showing a 1 for them. If I want to get rid of my filters just quickly, I can undo the filter bar, and we're back to seeing the whole table. All right, so we've already done a lot. The next 4 columns are going to be something that we don't go over in the foundations course that I teach, but more the intermediate and one-on-one training. This is how do you do pull in information when you have to match on multiple criteria. So here we need to get what is their most recent left ventricular ejection fraction. And to do that, we need to know what's the date of the most recent ejection fraction for them. So let's take a peek at our results information again. And we can see here in our table, it's by patient ID. We have the date. The test name of interest is going to be LVEF. Now, in real world scenarios, you might actually see multiple different order names or other complexities. But in this case, we just have this single LVEF. And then it's the result column that we're going to want to pull in. The unit would be nice to have, but because it's always going to be percent in our data set, we can just pull in this result. All right, so let's do this first. We're going to get what is the most recent LVEF date, which is, again, we're going to use the max ifs. So let's do max ifs our range. Actually, before I do this, let's put that data into a table. So insert, we'll put it into a table just like before. And let's call this one results. Now when we go back to our data collection tool, we can do max ifs. Our max range is going to be from the results table, and we want the date. Our first criteria is going to, or for the range, is going to be again from the results table, and we're going to match on this patient ID. And the criteria is our patient ID over here in column A. Our second criteria is going to be the name of the lab. So we only want to pull in what's the most recent date for ejection fractions. So we'll pull back up the results table. We'll go to the test name. And for the criteria, we're just going to hard code in the name of this test, LVEF, and putting it in between quotation marks, or because it is a static text data that we want to use. We can close the parentheses and we'll hit enter. You can see some patients don't have an EF and it's just pulling in a 0. And this makes sense. They don't have heart failure. So maybe they've just never had their ejection fraction measured before. What I'm going to do is let's actually clean those up so that way they just appear blank. So with this, I'm going to come up here. I'm going to highlight this and Control C to copy. I'm going to nest this inside of an if function. So I'm just going to type if. And here's my logical test. And if this equals 0, I'm just going to do an empty string, so a set of double quotes. If it's not equal to 0, now I'll just paste in the original function. And I'll hit enter, and now you can see here it just looks empty instead of having a 0. That is more just a personal preference. You don't actually have to do that, though. You can see when I did the control down, though, it actually brings me to the end of the data set. So Excel's not truly treating these like empty cells. It sees this formula. So this is in the cell. It's just only displaying an empty string. So another call out in terms of matching and other uses of functions with those values. But I'm going to highlight it, go back to home, and let's show these as their dates. All right, so now we need to do an XLOOKUP. We need to match on the patient, we need to match on this date, and we need to match on the test name for LVEF. But when we did an XLOOKUP before, we only matched on a single criteria. And so how do we then match on multiple criteria? So let's talk about this. Over here, we've got, again, just 2 patients, the date of interest that we want to pull the result for, and then we have our reference data over here. So in both cases, we should be pulling this ejection fraction, their most recent one. So we'll use the XLOOKUP function to do this. Now, the lookup value before, we were putting in things like, the patient ID or the encounter number. But here we have to match off of multiple criteria. So we're going to be running a series of tests, and we'll be multiplying those results together. And in Excel, false is 0 and true is 1. So in our lookup value, whenever you're doing multiple criteria, your lookup value will always be 1. And I'll show that more once we get to the next parameter. Our lookup array is now where we're going to be doing multiple tests. So each test that we're going to do has to be in a set of parentheses, and then we'll multiply them together. So our first test is going to be, is this the correct patient? So I'll do open parenthesis, and we want the value in cell A2. And then we're going to set it equal to our range of data over here, the patient ID. And again, I'll use F4 to lock this in place since I don't have this in a table. We'll close the parentheses. Now that's our first test. I'm going to use an asterisk to multiply. And now we're going to say in our second test, open parenthesis, this date in B2 has to equal the date in this column. I will then use F4 to lock this in place. Close my parentheses. Now our final test. So we'll multiply this, open parentheses. We can't see it because the function's getting kind of long, but we need the test name to equal LVEF. So I'm just going to hard code that, and then equals, and then our range here, and F4. Now in this case, they all say LVEF, so you technically wouldn't need it, but in the data set that we'll be doing for the data collection tool, there were multiple different types of tests, so we do need this test name. So let's just walk through the portion that we have so far. So we set our lookup value equals to 1. We now have 3 series of tests where we're checking for the patient, the date, and the test name, and we're multiplying them together. It's going to evaluate each of these tests, and if it finds a match, it'll be 1. If it doesn't, it'll be 0. If it finds a match, it'll be 1. If it doesn't, it'll be 0. If it finds a match, it'll be 1. And again, if it doesn't, it'll be 0. So only where all 3 tests match will it be 1 times 1 times 1, which equals 1. If any of these tests fail, it'll be a 0. And anytime you multiply by 0, the result will be 0, which will then not match our lookup value. So that's the reason why this is always 1. And then we just do our series of tests as part of this lookup array. Our return array is going to be very similar to what we had before. It is going to be just this result. So I will do this as a range and then put it with the dollar signs again by hitting F4 and then close my parentheses. So here, when I drag this down, you can see we now get 21, which is the most recent one here. Now for this patient, it was 29 on both examples, so that's not a lot of fun. Let's actually just change this one. And you can see this now updates to 35 appropriately because it's not going to match this. The date doesn't match. Only here is it the patient, the date, and the test name that does match. So we're going to use this same set of tools to then pull in the ejection fraction from the results tab on our data collection tool. So we'll start by typing in XLOOKUP. Because we'll be matching on multiple criteria, this lookup value is going to be 1. Our lookup array is again going to be that series of tests that are all in parentheses and multiplied together. So our first one will be, does the patient ID match? So we'll do equals results, open square bracket, and then patient ID, close the square bracket, close our parenthesis. Second test will multiply, open parenthesis. It needs to be this date equals the date from our results table, close parenthesis, asterisk to multiply, and then our final test is LVEF needs to equal the results test name. Then we will close that parenthesis. Our return array, again, will be from the results table, and it will be the result itself. I'll show it to you as is here. And you can see we're getting NAs. So in COUNTIF, when it didn't find a match, it just said 0. XLOOKUP, anytime it looks for a match and it can't find one, it's going to return an error. Well, there's a parameter that we can use within XLOOKUP that will prevent this. So this if not found is where we're going to put in just the empty string. And again, this is just for visual. So here I'll do one more comma. You can see we're on the if not found parameter. And I'll just do quotes and then another set of quotes. I'll hit enter. And now we've got the ejection fraction for each of these dates and patients. We can do the exact same thing for the EGFR date. So again, you could come up here and just copy this, paste it, and then every place that it says LVEF, we can do EGFR. Enter. You can see even patients who don't have an ejection fraction all have an estimated GFR. And again, we can take this one, copy it, and we'll paste it. Instead of it being LVEF, we're going to do EGFR. And then we also need to do that here. GFR. All right, copied in the wrong thing. Nope, wrong function. Here we'll do EGFR, and then instead of the LVEF date, we want the EGFR date. And now those have all pulled in. And you now have a completed data collection tool. So if you wanted to figure out, well, who are the patients that have heart failure and aren't on an SGLT2, those maybe are the patients that you want to look for. I can come up into the data tab and click my filters. And I'm just going to filter out the patients who don't have heart failure. And I don't want the patients who are already on an SGLT2. So these are the main patients to focus in on and review for further criteria to see if they truly be a candidate or not. If you wanted to even sort this descending or ascending, newest to oldest on actually next visit date, we now have a list of, let's see here. We now have our patients, who's going to be appearing in the clinic first. So if you could only get to a few patients, these would be the initial ones that you might want to reach out to, as they're going to be seen the most recent in the clinic. As well as, maybe their blood pressure is low or they have other medications that you might want to review. This could be your priority list. If you wanted to also analyze this data, you could use a pivot table. So clicking anywhere within our table, I'm just going to click this pivot. I'm going to do a new worksheet. And although we won't get too much into it in this workshop, we can just show, okay, well, how many of the patients that we reviewed happen to have heart failure? So maybe let's just count our patient IDs, and it defaults to a sum because it looks like a number. I'm just going to switch this, and we can see there were 35 patients. Rename this so that way it makes more sense. Who had HFrEF? And here we could start to filter. So let's do maybe on an SGLT2, we want just the nose. So different ways that you can start to splice your data. Pivot tables are great for very quick drag and drop functionality to be able to summarize your data. But Sally, with that, if there aren't any questions in the chat, you have now analyzed a simulated data set start to finish in about an hour. And the more you do it, that hour will become 30 minutes, will become 15 minutes, the more comfortable you become with some of these functions. I'm seeing a question by Ayana. Will this be available to watch later somehow? I believe so. So I believe in the LinkedIn live event, it will record. So if you go back into the event, you'll be able to see the playback of it.
Yes. I I I was here stuck trying to figure out how to take myself off mute and put the
No
camera
worries.
back on. But yeah, the one question that's in the chat is whether or not this video is going to be available again. It will be available on LinkedIn Live as well as the Resi Prep YouTube channel. I'll reshare this again on YouTube for anyone who wasn't able to learn with us today. And Adam, how can people reach out to you directly? You have a workshop coming up in the week. Is there going to be information or is there a link to register for that you can drop in the comment box here as well for them?
Yeah, so for the upcoming workshops, it will be a two-part workshop. So it'll be 2 hours on Saturday, November 4th from 1 to 3 Eastern, as well as 1 to 3 Eastern on Sunday. And it will be for a certificate as well. So you'll get the 4 hours of experience. You'll also get to analyze a separate simulated MUE scenario.
Okay.
And then get a certificate of completion talking about some of the skills that you've learned. You can register for it on the Sparx Analytics website.
Okay.
So I will drop that into the chat, as well as I'll put a link to it in the event for this LinkedIn live event.
Very good.
It's currently 50% off for students, so $75 for students, and then $150 for non-students.
Okay.
But there's also opportunities if you're currently working on a project. And again, no sensitive data has to be shared, and we can still do some targeted training.
Yeah.
If you're a resident, if you're a student on a project, or a practicing pharmacist outside of postgraduate training, can work on different projects, as well as one-on-one or group training sessions as well.
Awesome.
So yeah, so I'll drop the website in both of those locations. Again, I'm always happy to chat. So if you ever just want to meet to run a question by me, can catch up with me on LinkedIn, either my personal profile or the Sparx Analytics profile. From both of those, I do post Excel and SQL tutorials. So you can find other just one-off helpful things using simulated pharmacy data. As well as if you want to set up a web meeting, you can do that as well through my website and the links for Calendly on both of those profiles. So always.
Yes, and those one-off videos that Adam's describing, he's super casual about it. I've been looking at those a lot to help me on my projects, and I find them really, really helpful. I think Adam's frozen at the moment. So definitely look up Sparx Analytics and reach out. He's incredibly responsive on LinkedIn. Whether you use the Sparx website or you use his personal LinkedIn, he's very responsive, and he'll get back to you. If you were here today and you benefited from this workshop, we'd love to hear from you. I know Adam would love to also hear from you to see how he could make this bigger, repeat this, do this, improve anything that we've done on it. Maybe we need to do it on a different day to get more people to be on the simulation live. But we would love to hear from you. I personally would love to hear from you to know if this is something or workshops like these or things that you find helpful or even beneficial. Quite a few of you were watching live today, so it tells me a little bit that yes, people are interested. Adam, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
teaching us.
pleasure was all mine.
Yeah, I was here and watching all these functions. Like, I know they live in Excel, but I'm like, I have no clue what these things do. So again, I will be one of the people reviewing the YouTube video and will probably reach out to you when I have questions.
Oh, definitely. And, that's totally normal. The first time you see it,
Mhm.
it can feel like I was going a million miles an hour. And then once you watch for, certain segments or you do it a few times, then it really clicks. So I'm
Yeah,
glad that it does record for anyone who does want to go back and watch it again.
and watch it. Thank you so much. I don't see any other questions, but I know quite a few people did join us on live, both on YouTube and LinkedIn. So, again, reach out directly to Adam if you have any questions. Let me know if you find the session helpful, if it's something that we may want to redo again, or a component of it that we want Adam to focus on and give us more detail about. Those are all things I'd be happy to figure out a way to make happen for all of you. But with that, thank you. And Adam, thank you so much and have a great rest of your Sunday evening. Thank you for doing this for us.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for having me.
No
All right.
problem. Bye,
Take
everybody. Good
care.
night.